everyone. I hope you're enjoying the book fair. I'm Haley. I'm an artist and organizer based in Mendoza, Argentina, and I'm here with Naomi. Introduce yourself.
Hi everyone. My name is Naomi. I am an artist and social media manager, publicist based out of Mexico City. And do you want me to tell me? I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I am Mexican and Jamaican. I didn't grow up speaking Spanish, but I eventually decided that it was something very important to me to learn it. So I moved to Puebla, Mexico when I was 18 without knowing the language, started university and learned it really fast because I had to. And I've been based out of Mexico ever since, basically nonstop.
Great. So our issue we have here is Speciwomen. And it's translated in both English and Spanish. It's has many Cuban artists from the diaspora living abroad, and it's translated both in Spanish and English. Why is the translation of Spanish and English important for accessibility in art publications?
So I think one of the things that art always aims to do is start conversations that are really important, give people context to the living situations of others, give people context to the humanity that other people are experiencing. And I think translation has always been a political act. When we make things accessible for people, make ideas accessible for people in different languages, that means that we're able to share more ideas across cultures, across countries, and I think that's what moves us forward as humanity, no?
Great. I'm going to just ask a few more questions, and then we're going to watch some films that relate to this topic and to the issue. My next question for you is, in Speciwomen, we feature both English and Spanish in a single issue. And I want to ask you why it's important to feature both in a single issue versus having multiple editions.
Right. So a little introduction to Speciwomen. Speciwomen is a feminist magazine based out of New York that focuses on artists, on women artists, and giving them a platform to really talk about their practices. This is our first edition we've ever done that's bilingual. The first 4 editions were all in English. And in this edition, we decided that we were going to try something different, and I was brought onto the team to help make that happen. Sorry, could you repeat the question one more time?
Yeah. Why is it important to feature both languages in a single issue versus multiple editions?
Right. So I think a lot of times what happens with translations is we have one issue that will be completely in English and another issue that will be in Spanish, and we don't necessarily get to see the translations right next to each other. But like I mentioned before, translation is a political act. Everybody who will translate is going to do it differently. Put emphasis on different things or omit things, because the idea of translation is getting the same idea across. It's not necessarily making word for word everything exactly the same. You just want, it needs to be understood the same. So what happens when you put both languages together in the same book is that you give a lot of respect to the reader. No, we respect that the reader. There's a lot of people that can understand both. There's a lot of people that can read both, and we also want them to be able to, read the translation, decide if that's how they would have translated it, and actually see what the artist meant on one side and how we translated it on the other. Maybe we got it right. Maybe they would have done something differently. I think that having both on the same pages it's important. I think that we should have more publications and that are bilingual or trilingual of multiple languages. That being said, it is hard. It's hard to get it right. There's a huge margin of error sometimes. It's not a simple task to execute, and but I think it's worth it.
It's totally worth it. In the issue, there's a lot of different dialects of Spanish, of Cuban Spanish, of
No. David.
of Cuban Spanish, of different people moving into different countries and then acquiring sort of a different vernacular. And I'm wondering how the dialects affected the translation, and also what remains untranslatable, what is hard to translate from Spanish to English in an art context.
So one of the things that I think happens with Spanish is that everywhere you go, anybody who's learned or tried to start learning Spanish would tell you that anywhere you go to learn Spanish, once you've learned the Spanish of that area, don't move, because if you leave, it's going to be different. And the Spanish in Spain is different from the Spanish in Cuba. The Spanish in Argentina is different from the Spanish in Mexico.
Very different.
Super different. And I think what happens is what we learned was that it was really important to have people that were transcribing who had that context already, who understood Cuban Spanish. Because if you have somebody who speaks Spanish from Spain try to transcribe a conversation of Cuban artists speaking Spanish from Cuba, there's going to be a larger margin of error.
And what remains translatable between English and Spanish specifically, do you think? What jumps out at you?
So between English and Spanish, I think one of the things, and we've talked about this, that translating from one language to another can be easier or harder depending on the kind of vocabulary you have for the subject in one language or another. One of the things that can be kind of hard to translate to Spanish, to English, from English to Spanish for is racism. We have a lot of really detailed vocabulary to talk about race in English that doesn't necessarily exist in Spanish yet. But when we're doing something like art, I think what we started to notice was that there would be certain words that Cuban Spanish will just adopt. They didn't feel the need a lot of the time to look for some long-winded translation. If something fit what they needed to say, they would say it in English with a Spanish accent, with an accent in Cuban Spanish, and that was that. And that's how they were getting their ideas across. And I love that too. I think that we also sometimes forget that translation isn't black or white. We use a lot of both languages when we're speaking day-to-day life, right? We're using a lot of Spanish when we're speaking in English. We're using a lot of English when we're speaking in Spanish. We're using a lot of languages we don't even know we're using. Languages are, they're mixy.
Yeah, and they're living entities, yeah. And it's about communicating or seeing, okay, what's here, and just what comes to your mind, and just having that rapid kind of communication.
Absolutely, they're very alive.
And I think it's also, these are interviews, so the kind of language that the artists are using are very informal, and there is a lot of borrowing. And also with titling, when you title something, you keep the Spanish title a lot of the time, and they don't make a translation sometimes, because that's how it's meant to be said. And whatever language you speak, that's how you're going to say the title. So there's also this like push and pull and refusal that happens, where we're adopting some things and other things we're refusing, and we're saying, no, this is in this language and it must be said this way.
I really love that idea, because it makes you think like, what is how a name is not necessarily translatable. A name is a name. Like a name is, it kind of floats above language sometimes. It means that this is this thing. Yeah. And I love that in a translation, you can choose. A translation is like a million micro choices. And you can choose to leave things a certain way if you feel like the core, if you feel like the truth will be twisted a little bit, tainted a little bit, you can choose, no, we're going to leave it exactly the way that it is and work around it. And I think that, again, it's not black and white, and all of those things are choices.
Beautiful. Can you share some other publications that are using multilingual models that you think are a good example or good to sort of turn to?
Definitely. So I work for another organization called Temblores. We have our table. It's over in H12, and we're doing contemporary art books that are uh, bilingual, English and Spanish. It's a really good reference. I also work for a magazine called Terremoto, and they are a contemporary art magazine. If you've heard of us, great. Based out of Mexico City, we cover most of Latin America, and we're doing a lot of things that are both English and Spanish. And one of the things I love that we're doing right now, we have a new editor who is fluent in Portuguese, so we're getting a lot of ideas, new ideas from Brazil that maybe we didn't have access to before, because we have access to a person who has the capabilities to translate, and that's really cool. So those are two really good resources. Both of them are available at our table at H12, and yeah, I think if you want bilingual in other languages, there's also a lot of other really good pieces. I've seen one of the pieces that surprised me the most was seeing a piece that was English. It was English, French, and Haitian Creole, and that was amazing.
And
cool.
there's also a lot of great examples around the fair and other places that we've been noticing.
Definitely.
So we're going to watch some films by an artist named Sandra Ramos. She's a multimedia artist and curator who gained worldwide recognition in the 1990s for her expression of her relationship of the political and social realities of living in Cuba and immigrating to the U.S. And I want to share a work, if you just press this.
Next.
Next. Oh, or we have this.
Other way, next,
Other
backwards.
way, yeah, backwards. I wanted to share one of her works before we see the films, which is, it's called Impossible Dialogue, and she's making here a connection between the ancient Sumerian disputes, which are the oldest word battles. They're clay uniform tablets, and they're messages, kind of arguments, poetic arguments between different people, and it's some of the oldest written argument. And she used this and then kind of compared it to cell phones and how we have polarizing language today, and had people come to an exhibit and also carve their own messages as if they would on social media. So she's drawing a relationship between historical language and ancient languages that we no longer speak, and how we're speaking to each other today, and how we alienate each other with our language. And I thought that it was just a nice thing to share before we watch some of the films. The films use water as a metaphor for the way we think about Cuba, but I think water is also a beautiful metaphor for translation and for the way that we flow between different ways of expressing ourselves through different mediums. Sandra's a multimedia artist, as are many of the artists in the issue. And yeah, what do you think about that metaphor about water and translating?
I think that it really ties into the idea that, like I said, translating isn't black and white. It has to be fluid. Translating now will be different in 20 years, and we have to respect that because language is going to change. Language has changed so much in the last 2 decades, in the last 5 years even, with everything that's going on and has happened. So I think that, I think that the fluidity is a really good metaphor for that. And I also think a lot of what Sandra talks about, islands are so specific because they have a level of isolation that lets us observe their cultures in a way that's different to other places. My dad's side is from Jamaica, and I think that there's a lot of things that are very specific to that place and can kind of live in that space and change internally a lot. So it's I think water also kind of represents that sort of level of isolation and the fluidity that the creatives have to find new ways of making things in a place that's relatively isolated.
Great. Let's start. We're going to watch some films.
Yeah.
Turn down the lights, maestro.
What's behind
Close
us?
to me. I'm the maestro, apparently.
Thank you, David. All right.
Here we go. We have 3 short films. Sound good? We have sound?
Let's put the sound on. I see the button. Okay, let's pause it really quick. Here we go.
Stay with us, please. You'll be happy again.
Um,
We have one more.
Really love that last one. I think it's a good moment to give an introduction about Sandra Ramos and her work. Sandra Ramos is now in one of the more advanced stages of her career as an artist. Are we gonna?
Yeah, well, I already read a little bit of her bio, but I'll just give you her bio. in this issue, she does an interview with another artist and sort of talks about her work. She's a multimedia artist working with a lot of different mediums, but all the animations are really compelling. She draws on characters from art, literature, and philosophy to connect these issues with history and social practices. So for me, the figures are sort of representative of like I think the complexities of her experience being Cuban and the different waves of immigration and political happenings in Cuba. And she talks a lot about it. I think in the issue is a really great way to get to know the history of Cuba more, if that's something that you're interested in, because it has the sort of lived experience of 12 artists really mapped out.
Exactly. I think one of the things that's really interesting about the last one, Aquarium, is kind of touching back on the idea that we said that there's a cultural context that's really hard for people that haven't lived in Cuba to understand. And what I love about the art and a lot of the collective works of all of the artists in Speciwomen is that they leave a lot of what the feelings that they feel up to interpretation, and that's what art is really good at. That I think a lot of mediums don't accomplish. Right? It's so hard for it's. I could tell you what it's like to live there and what it's like to live there and what it's like to live there, but I think what the art tries to do, and a lot of her pieces try to do, is really like make you feel what it feels like. And that last video about like the trying to leave, the trying to make it better, all of those things, which a lot of the artists had so many really strong feelings about, and that I got to see in the interviews, is that it's such a really difficult context to wrap your head around if you haven't lived there. And I love Sandra's work, and I think that it's really great that we get to show these videos here, these animations, because those are things that can't be printed, but also definitely should be shared.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the image for me of the racetrack, of the kite, and of the aquarium, and they're sort of boxed in and thinking about this like method, this idea of being locked into something and then also having a fluid motion within it, and like this thing of escaping through air or through water, but also working within the confines of what is in that space. And these figures are also kind of colonial and interacting with this sort of natural environment.
Exactly.
And I think that this is also, for us talking about translation, is very important, thinking about like working within the confines of the languages we have. What can we communicate? What stories can we tell? And how can we, through putting multiple together, show the differences in what's possible through a language like Spanish or a language like English or Portuguese or what have you.
Definitely. I think also as Americans, and this is something, Coco Fusco was the woman who got us in contact with the 12 artists. They're not all artists. There's 8 artists and 4 artist curators to help us with the issue, help us make it happen, and through their interviews, create a dialogue. And I think Coco Fusco has been exiled for a number of years now from Cuba, and I think one of the things that she was always really adamant about was that we didn't understand. We couldn't understand. We did, as Americans, there is a whole nother political context that's been pushed upon us about Cuba for decades, for various reasons, for, the way that the United States runs their world politics. And what I love about trying to solve this like breach of understanding through art is that I think art doesn't come out with pretensions of ever really believing it's going to make you fully know something, but the effort that it tries, the effort that it puts forth is and so earnest. And I do believe that after doing this magazine, I feel like I'm closer to understanding than I was before I started on this endeavor. And I just want to say, to be an artist, the one thing that I can tell you that I truly feel that kind of was true across all of the artists that participated in making this magazine is that to be an artist in any context takes an enormous and tremendous amount of bravery. These people, I'm going to emotional think about it. These people, put off material gains. They put off emotional stability on some level to say the truth. Just tell the truth the way that they see it and whatever that means for them. And in a context like Cuba, that means something really different than it means in other places. And here it also means something really strong than it does in other places. And I think that's true about anywhere that you go. And that's something that I feel really, really lucky to have been able to participate in, making a platform. Because sometimes if you're conscious that you don't understand something, the second best thing you can do is make a space where maybe you can get closer to understanding it. Yeah.
I think that's beautifully put. I want to open up the room for some questions and ideas about what we've seen and heard.
Anybody have any questions? Have any of you enjoyed a piece of bilingual literature? Brought anything? Yeah, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, German to English, you said? Or, okay, nice. Very cool. Yeah. Right, so like I said, this was our first time doing this process. I'm going to give you the process in the best of context of when it worked perfectly. So we have because let me tell you, it was something to be ironed. We start with the conversation. We had the list of all of the contacts, and we kind of combed through their works, and we thought, okay, these people have something in common to make a good conversation. These people have absolutely nothing in common. They also make a good conversation. We started them with groups like that. We paid all of the curators to conduct the interviews between the artists, and then we recorded those interviews, and then we sent those interviews to be transcribed. So they were written out word for word, how the people expressed themselves. And then we had them whittled down, made something comprehensive, because the way we talk, me and you, I say, I maybe repeat myself. Maybe I didn't actually finish that thought and I just kind of, things like that. That when you're reading it would be choppy. So we went back, we made that cohesive, made it make sense, and then we took that and we sent it to be translated. And then after it was translated, we sent it back to the artists. They were like, this is awful, what have you done? Perfect. And then we go back and we copy edited again. We took notes from the artists. We made sure they felt that they were expressing themselves they wanted to be, the way they wanted to be heard, the way they wanted to be understood. And then from those translations, we had somebody who is really, really familiar with the way that, because we had to make like the same set of rules to be followed for the whole issue, right? So we made sure that somebody went through and kind of made sure that was happening in both Spanish and in English. And then we asked for all of the art to accompany the pieces. And then we got all of the captions for all of the art. And then we reached out to Alejandra Gonzalez. And Alejandra Gonzalez, I love this story because this is a story of how just because you plan something a certain way doesn't necessarily work out. Alejandra Gonzalez is the beautiful person on the cover. This specific work is about women and submissiveness and how the rules that we have to adhere to sort of act in a certain role that is given to us. And a little bit of like how silly that can feel and is. She missed her interview. She just missed it. She had a fever. She didn't get to her interview. So the interview happened without her. We had two other artists, an artist and a curator interview without her. She was very sad, and we said, we still want you to participate. And we asked her if she would do a visual essay. And she ended up being on the cover and also on the back. And yeah, there was things that worked super smoothly in ways that I couldn't even have imagined. There were things that didn't work smoothly and needed a lot of care. The artists put so much work and their whole souls into this, and that was amazing. I think that it's really hard for artists not to put their whole soul into everything they do. So, yeah, that was. Did that answer your question a little bit? The process.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Think about, yeah. Yeah.
It's a huge task. It's a huge task, but sometimes we take it for granted. We know, but we take
Yeah.
it for granted sometimes. And then that is so different from reading.
Yeah.
And that is so different from something being written down. So we're really we're not only trying to like bridge English and Spanish, which is important, but we're trying to bridge conversation and like written work, which is massively challenging.
Yeah. In my previous work, I also have translated text from English into Spanish with a group, and I did one in LA where we made sure that the person we hired to make the translation was Mexican American specifically, and not Mexican or Argentinian or this or that, because having that cultural specificity to make a direct translation was better for the artists in our issue. But now I'm working in Argentina, and I often will be translating from the Argentine Spanish into English. And that's, it has a different set of rules. It has a different set of understandings. And in Argentina, I have one level of understanding of Spanish from this country, and living there, we have these slang, we have all these different kinds of forms of speaking. Argentines often will say words backwards, where the spelling is backwards. So instead of cafe, you have fecha, or these kind of subtleties in the language that can be really hard to decipher as a non-native speaker. But I think that having things written out and kind of exploring these poetic things together really helps. I really love poetry translations between different languages, because I think that poetry is a really nice vehicle for exploring how things can be translated very, very differently. And for me, like if I'm reading a novel, I might read it from multiple translators and find the experience very different and say, oh, actually, I really like this translation, but this other translation just, for me, is a miss. I think there's like a Roberto Bolaño book that for me and this one translator is the one and the rest are shit. And people have really strong opinions about it.
Well, it's a political act. Like we said, translation is a political act. And then when you're talking about art, it's a soulful act. It's very difficult, and it's very important, right?
It's even harder.
It's even harder.
And then a lot of these people are also living abroad and then pick up a different sort of dialect or way of speaking. And it's hard to, at the same time, have a system that works for all of the artists and have a system that's understandable for English speakers and English readers that catches those subtleties. And I also, I wanted to comment on that something we were talking about earlier. I feel like there is the bravery conversation, being brave enough to like speak. I think with this issue, I feel that these artists are brave, but also it's important that we're showing this context in American artists with American artists through a New York publication. And that context is important because we're bringing this to a different audience. And it offers sort of a level of protection to the artists. And a lot of these artists are working outside of Cuba. And a lot of Cuban artists in Cuba aren't afforded this kind of reach or afforded this kind of accessibility, which I think is really beautiful and one of the things.
And it's missing. And it's missing. And when we can make that happen, we should.
Absolutely.
It's our responsibility.
Yeah, and in museums and all these different places, there's so much bureaucracy behind how people translate something, or if they have wall texts in multiple languages and translating, and there's so much red tape often in the way that things are said. So I think it's great for these sort of grassroots publications to really take it on, because it's a huge challenge and we can choose how we want to translate and talk about things and show things.
And what we want to talk about. If we want an all-female publication of Cuban artists, we can make that happen if that's something that we choose and that is important to us. So
that's the great part, is like building the community. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah. It's different. I think there's, George Louis Bourgeois, that writer, he is quoted as saying he was a native Spanish speaker and wrote in Spanish, but he said, English is my favorite language because there are so many ways to say something. There's so many different ways. Every word has many, many meanings. I think in the US, I mean, translating from Spanish into English, I think it's really all about who is translating it and what their experience is and how they approach it. And there's sometimes teams of translators or a single person, but it's really about who that person is and where they're from and how they approach language. You'll find, even within California, people writing at very different sort of levels, or maybe one word has more specificity. But like Naomi said earlier, in different contexts, we have different words for things. So like we were talking about with race, in English we have certain words for that, but we don't have them in other languages. So this thing sort of happens where there's discrepancies between the language, and some things just can't be translated. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think touching on what Haley said, the differences are going to depend on who's translating. So exactly what you said, like if you're translating from Spanish to in what you're talking about, right? Because like we said before, there's things that we have just too many words for even in one language. My favorite example is like in English, we have so many ways to say snow. No, like snow, fluff. I'm from Iowa, so slush, sludge, which is when it mixes with mud. That does not exist in Spanish. There is not a list of words for all the ways that snow can get dirty. Because it's not context matters. Spanish from Argentina is different than Spanish in Mexico.
I think in Argentina there are actually, in where I am, I'm by the Andes, and there are words for snow, and a lot of the dogs are named Snow. Snowcita, kind of, or like this kind of thing, but it's not a million different words, a million different ways to say it. It's very much like, context dependent, I think.
Context dependent. Yeah. Context dependent. That's your answer.
Yeah, and art is very difficult to talk about in any language because it's subjective, and it's also sort of the reason it's art and not a piece of writing, or for visual art, the reason it's art and not a piece of writing is because we're trying to say something that can't be said through words. So then to try to talk about something that can't be said through words in multiple languages is so difficult. So yeah, but please check out the issue and you'll read more about it.
Yeah, so it's going to be, the table is P20, I believe. It's right over here by the front door. And the girl watching the table is Izzy, and she's lovely. Yeah, she's great. And get your issues. I believe there's 1, 2, there isn't 3, 4, and then 5. So all of those are available, and 5 is the latest issue with Alejandra Gonzalez on the cover. I also would like to shout out Philo. Philo's the one who made this happen. Philo is, I just want to say, she's a fearless leader. She really, really, really decided it was going to happen, and then didn't let anything stop her. And let me tell you, we had our challenges. We did this in 5 months. And yeah, she really did that. So Philo Cohen, also an artist. Excellent artist. You should check out her work and check out Speciwomen.
Gracias. Ciao, ciao.
Okay. Yay, that was perfect.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Have fun at the rest of the fair, y'all.
Have fun, fair.
Come visit us at our booth.